Some time ago, my wife and I were approached by the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they had saw the fire within us because we were excited. We were learning about the sacred names. We were learning about other things that we had not known about before. We had that first initial love, and I'm happy to say I don't think it's lost. I think that there's a continuing renewedness of this fire, this life-giving energy that Yahweh provides when He calls and when we receive of His Spirit through the laying on of hands and through the process of baptism and all of that. But they had actually had someone over in Israel that had been inquiring through the rabbis there, different information, and he came back. This was a Hebrew scholar. He came to our place of residence. And but we went through some books, but when we got to the book of Romans, I had some difficulty. This is about 15 years ago. I think I see it clearly now, but back then I couldn't explain properly this book. So today we want to look at the book of Romans and starting in chapter 1. So if you'd like to follow along, it'll be a journey. Paul, a bondservant of Messiah Yahshua, called as an apostle, set apart for the evangel of Elohim. He starts out saying, look, I am an apostle. I am a bondservant of the Messiah. We also are bondservants in that we are willing servants. We deny our own will to be in His will. And guess what? His will was to do the Father's will. He said when he was at the time that the toughest trial of his life, he said, not my will, but your will be done, because he was preparing to be sacrificed for us. He knew that he had to go through it, but he was willing to go through that for us, and he did go through that for us. The apostle, the term apostle is interesting. It's specific. As we saw in Revelation here not too long ago, there are 12 apostles. There are only 12 apostles. And to be an apostle, one, you have to be a witness of the resurrection of the Messiah, or the resurrected Messiah. You find this in Acts 1 and verse 22. You don't have to go there. But also 1 Corinthians 9:1. But in Revelation 21 in verse 14, it says that there are only 12 apostles. And we find that an apostle is one who is sent, but specifically one who is sent by the risen Messiah, having been seen of Him and having seen Him. And the reason I wanted to bring this out, because there are some who say they are apostles, but that can't be. Not in the sense of the definition of what we find as an apostle. Verse 2, which He promised beforehand through His prophets in the Holy Scriptures. In this particular Bible, there is, on page 1503, a chart of messianic prophecies found in the Old Testament. Line of Abraham, line of Judah, line of David. And it gives the scriptures, Genesis 12:2, Genesis 49:10. And then it gives the fulfillment in the New Testament of these things. And in January of this year, we sent out a newsletter that had a full list, fuller than this, of all these different messianic prophecies showing that this is the one. Yahshua was the one prophesied to come. But notice that Paul is saying he's referring to the Father. He's saying, which He promised beforehand through the prophets and the Holy Scriptures. And I wanted to emphasize that because as we go down to verse 8, and into 9, and into 10, he's going to emphasize it even more. But verse 3 said concerning the Son. So verse 2 is actually concerning the Son, who was born of the descendant of David according to the flesh, which was declared the Son of Elohim with power by the resurrection from the dead, according to the Spirit of holiness, Yahshua the Messiah, our Master, through whom we have received, now he's speaking of the apostles here because it says apostleship, whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience and faith are of faith among all the Gentiles for his name's sake. I'm reading through the New American Standard Bible, and I looked in the interlinear, and this word of is not there. In fact, one translation says, obey the faith. Well, how do you obey a faith? Well, if the household of faith is under Yahweh and the Messiah, then we would be abiding in their house rules, wouldn't we? So it's no surprise that there is the word obedience here. There's also the word grace and faith. There's also his name that's mentioned. But if you mention obedience and his name, people look at you and think, well, that's a little odd. We don't emphasize the sacred names, and we don't emphasize obedience, but we'll emphasize grace and faith. That's verse 5 there. In verse 6 it says, among whom you are also called of Yahshua the Messiah, to all who are beloved of Elohim in Rome, called as saints. So this is a title that we can have, saints, if we're found in the grace and peace of Messiah Yahshua, which it says, to all who are beloved of Elohim in Rome, called as saints, grace to you, peace from Yahweh our Father and the Master, Yahshua the Messiah. There's definitely a separation between Yahweh the Father and the Son, and this is pretty clear throughout. But you do have some that teach, well, there's only the Son who is the Father, and that's just a distortion. Certainly he came in his image, his exact representation. So everything that he did was exactly in line with the Father. And if we're in line with the Messiah as a bondservant, literally as a slave, a willful relationship there, that we'll be doing exactly as the Messiah did, we'll be doing exactly as the Father wants of us. But notice in verse 8, he starts after this introduction. He says, first, of most importance, of priority, I thank my Elohim through the Master Yahshua for all of you, because your faith is, or for you all, because your faith is being proclaimed throughout the whole world. Now here's this an assembly in Rome in the midst of paganism and polytheistic teachings, and their faith is so strong they are identified and are talked about worldwide. Is it just because they believe? I don't think so. Because they have obedience with that faith. It has to be both. Notice that in verse 9 it says, for Yahweh whom I serve in my spirit in the preaching of the evangel is my witness as to how unceasingly I make mention of you. If we think of in the spirit, a lot of people will say, well, yeah, I'm in the spirit. But we have to address not only the heart, but the mind as well. In Romans 7 and 22, let's go over there for a second. Just hold your place here. Romans 7 and verse 22. The Apostle Paul says, I joyfully concur with the law of Yahweh in the inner man. In verse 23 it says, but I see a different law in my members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin which is in my members. So he struggled. We all struggle as well. But the point is, he didn't just give up the law of Yahweh and say, well, all I have to do is have faith and believe. And we're hearing that more and more, and we're seeing more disgusting things infiltrating the churches, so-called churches today, which we know stems from the 4th century and Roman Catholicism, which has daughters, Protestantism, if that's a word, Protestants stemming from that. And it's a mess. And there's going to be a restoration of things, and I think we're in this mode here doing restoration. But going back to Romans 1, it says, always in my prayers, making requests, I perhaps now, at last, by the will of Elohim, I may succeed in coming to you. So he's been wanting to go there for quite some time. But as we go through this book of Romans, he evidently hasn't been there before to see this assembly. He wasn't the one that established it. It was someone else. But he still has a desire to go to them because their faith is known. He wants to impart more to them if he can. And he also wants to receive from them in love, the things that make up the Spirit of Yahweh. It says, "For I long to see you," verse 10, "that I may impart some spiritual gift to you, that you may be established. That is, that I may be encouraged together with you, while among you, each of us by the other's faith, both yours and mine." It's encouraging when we come together. We have 3 guests here. Welcome. It's encouraging to see you here. It's encouraging for us, and I think it's encouraging for you as well. The same type of encouragement Paul wanted here from the brethren. In verse 13 he says, "I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I often have planned to come to you, and I have been prevented so far, so that I may obtain some fruit among you, also even as among the rest of the Gentiles." So they're not of Judah necessarily, not the majority of them evidently, because he's describing them among the Gentiles. Now that can get into who is Israel. We won't necessarily go into that too much here. But it's important to understand what's being said and glean as much information as we can from this book, and to be ready. And, a good thing for going through this chapter by chapter and reading this and having our Bibles open is so that we can mark these areas that stand out as important, because there will be those that will ask us for the faith that we have, and they'll say, well, isn't it just faith? I mean, we don't have to do those Jewish things. Well, we can take them to the book of Romans, because there are some things specifically in here that will jar them if they haven't seen them before. Verse 14, "I am under obligation both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish." Oh, what? If I was receiving this letter, I'm like, are you calling me foolish? I'm just thinking how it might be received just as it's being given. But I think they took the letter well. Verse 15, "So for my part, I am eager to preach the evangel to you also who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the evangel, for it is the power of Elohim for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." Verse 17, "For in it the righteousness of Yahweh is revealed from faith to faith." It's like saying from beginning to end, all generations should have faith in Yahweh. That's important to remember. This would be a good one to underline and make mention that, it's from the beginning to the end, that we should have faith in Yahweh. Because this is actually a quote from the Old Testament, as it goes on to say, "But the righteous man shall live by faith." And you find that mentioned in Habakkuk 2 and verse 4. But in Hebrews, let's go back to Psalm 119. Hold your place here. And I want to note the word righteous. What does that mean? It says the righteous man will live by faith. Well, how do you live by faith? Well, you live faith righteously. Well, what does righteousness mean? Psalm 119 and verse 151. "You are near, O Yahweh." Have we ever thought about that? That Yahweh is near? He's near if we're doing what's right. "You are near, O Yahweh, and all your commandments are truth." Backing up in verse 142, "Your righteousness is an everlasting righteousness. Your law is truth." Psalm 119 and verse 167, "Let my tongue sing of your word, for all your commandments are righteousness." Now right there you might just put on the side 1 John 5:17, because it says all unrighteousness is sin. And doesn't that tie into 1 John 3:4, which says that lawlessness or breaking of the law is sin? Whose law do you think they're talking about? So the opposite of being righteous is unrighteous. And what is unrighteousness? It's sin. What is sin? It's breaking of Yahweh's commandments. It all ties together. But you have to be ready with an answer if someone asks you about, well, what about the book of Romans? It just talks about faith. It talks about being justified by faith. It's true. But there's more to it than just meets the eye. But it's here as we go on, and we'll see this. But even if we go back to Romans 1 and verse 17 here, the righteous man will live by faith. If you think about the next verse, and interestingly enough, the New American Bible Standard breaks this apart, separates it, so you have all these different added words here. It says righteousness needed, condemnation, sin. It's a good point. Condemnation of the Gentile, cause condemnation, willful ignorance. And these things are mentioned there as commentary. But it separates this next verse, which is important. It says, for the wrath of Yahweh is revealed from heaven against all un-Yahweh likeness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Okay, unrighteousness. It's the opposite of righteousness. Even in going back to Psalm 119, we saw what truth was. Truth is keeping the commandments. So these men are suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. Does that remind you of anyone? Go over to 2 Peter, actually. 2 Peter 3 and verse 17. Actually, let's back up and get some context here. Verse 14 of 2 Peter 3. Therefore, beloved, since you look for these things, be diligent to be found by him in peace, spotless, blameless. What else is also known of the Messiah? That he was sinless. He did not sin, not once. He was blameless. He was spotless. And regard the patience of the Master of salvation, just as also our beloved brother Paul, according to the wisdom given to him, wrote to you, as also in all of his letters, speaking in them some of these things, in which are some things hard to understand, which the untaught and unstable distort. What would they be untaught and unstable in? As they do with the rest of the scriptures, to their own destruction. You, therefore, beloved, knowing this beforehand, be on your guard so that you are not carried away by the error of unprincipled men and fall from your own steadfastness. Now it says unprincipled. Here, King James says wicked. The original word is a thesmos. It means one who breaks through the restraint of the law. Lawless. What's it saying? It's saying lawless men. When we go back to Romans 1 and verse 18, men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness, he's talking about false teachers that justify themselves with Paul's writings. Because, in verse 19 it goes on, because that which is known about Elohim is evident within them. For Yahweh made it evident to them. For since the creation of this world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, divine nature, have been clearly seen, because are being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew Elohim, they did not honor him as Elohim, or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. I remember a motivational speaker called Zig Ziglar, and I just found out that he passed away here at the end of 2012. He's written a number of books. I used to listen to his messages, or not messages, but his motivational talks, and which were messages. And he was a religious man. He would talk about the Bible, and he mentioned that there was a group who took some atheists and asked them, "Would you be willing to take a lie detector test?" And they said, "Yeah, we'll take a lie detector test." And they told them beforehand, "We're going to ask you if you believe in God." And they were truthful when they were asked about other things. But when they said, or when they were asked, "Do you believe in God, the Creator, the Heavenly Father?" they all said no. And guess what? Liars. They're liars. Paul is right in saying that creation itself attests to the fact that there is a creation. And these men are liars. And because they are liars, Yahweh gave them over to a depraved mind, as we'll read here. And thinking, just stepping back a little bit, going to this idea of righteousness and faith, let's go over to Hebrews, because I noticed this section of the separation here. I'm wondering if that wasn't done on purpose, because when you put it together, it shows that faith should be with obedience. In Hebrews 10 and verse 38. Okay, where this comment is, but my righteous one shall live by faith. If he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. People bring up faith, and that's all they bring up. They don't bring up the context. They don't bring up the rest of it. Well, someone that has faith will be obedient. I think that's clear for us. But we need to be able to explain this to others. And it says, if he shrinks back, shrink back to what? Well, if we shrink back, we're shrinking back to our old man, our old person, to the way of the world. You back up into this, in verse 35 it says, do not throw away your confidence, which has great reward. In verse 36, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of Yahweh, it goes back to Yahweh, you may receive what was promised. Going back even further, you go into Hebrews 10, same chapter, but verse 26. It says, if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. That's serious. Because we accept the Messiah for that sacrifice so that we may be forgiven of our sins. But if you go on sinning, in verse 27 it says, a terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of fire which will consume the adversaries. That remains for the individual. So you have to take these things in context. But I just wanted to go back and touch upon that. We have to have our understanding clear about these things. And I'm certainly a lot better off now, 15 years later, than I was originally when I was trying to show out of this book to someone that was wanting to teach something else. Oh, we don't have to keep the Sabbath. Oh, we don't have to do those things. Really, it's not what the Word says. When we understand that Paul, his first priority was being in the will of the Father by being through the will of the Son, and giving honor to Yahweh and doing his will, it becomes very clear, because Yahweh's will is laid out through scriptures. And that's what they had, the Tanakh. These are just letters that we find today that gives us confirmation of what was going on. The Messiah had come. It was prophesied that he would. People needed to wake up to that and then accept him as their sacrifice, and then to go on being blameless with the help of the Spirit that was provided for that very purpose. But look at what happened to these they knew of Elohim. In fact, this was a polytheistic society. They would have checked into this mighty one called Elohim. Of course, at that time, the name had been covered up about 300 years previously. But Yahshua came and revealed the name to the disciples, who became the apostles. You find that in John 17. So they would have known. I mean, we have children even today growing up in schools like Sunday school, learning about the Bible. In fact, I was at one. I was visiting with my mom. My mom went to a Nazarene church. Well, I went with the youth pastor to the class there for the kids. One of the kids spoke up and said something, and the teacher said, "Oh, no. But that's what the Bible said, and the kid was right, and I almost spoke up. But I thought, well, I'm a visitor. I don't want to, ruffle any feathers or anything. I was young at the time. But I knew enough to know that kid was right. And he was, you could see the question mark in his mind because the teacher said he was wrong. Well, the teacher was wrong. But that's what we have today. We have false teachers teaching error. And it's not that they're doing it willfully. It's just that they don't know any better. So they're sincerely deceived. And, we're here swimming upstream, so to speak, trying to help people understand. But this is one book that can help people understand if they understand it correctly. But look at what happened to these people that knew enough to know better and yet refused. Verse 22, professing to be wise, they became fools. Isn't that what people are doing today even? I think of the fall of Rome, and I'm thinking this is just like what's happening today. And Rome fell. And this nation can fall unless we wake up. Verse 23, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible Elohim for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Well, we don't worship idols. Well, what about your car? What about that house? What about the senator? What about the president? Well, we want change. Well, you've got change. It's the same thing that people asked for with Saul. And Yahweh said, look, you're going to have trouble on top of trouble that you don't even understand. Oh, we don't care. We want change. We want it. Okay, you're going to get it. Verse 24, therefore Yahweh gave them over to the lust of their hearts, to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of Yahweh. What is the truth? His whole word. They exchanged the truth of Yahweh for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, Yahweh gave them over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. In the same way also, men abandon the natural function of the women and burn in their desire towards one another, men and men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. It was error? You better believe it was error. It was against the commandments of Yahweh. Let's go back to Leviticus 18. Hold your place here, because we'll be coming back, but Leviticus 18. And verse 22. You shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination. Over in chapter 20 of Leviticus, in verse 13. If there is a man who lies with a male as those who lie with a woman, both of them have committed a detestable act. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood guiltiness is upon them. The wrath remains. Abomination, detestable. We already saw indecent and degrading. Are those terms that we want among us? Absolutely not. Verse 28 of Romans 1. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge Yahweh, and who has Paul been emphasizing? He's been emphasizing Yahweh. Yes, he acknowledges the Son, but he's emphasizing Yahweh's ways, his will, and him first. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge Yahweh any longer, Yahweh gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper. There's another word we can put in the list, depraved. Verse 29 going on, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of Elohim, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they knew or although they know the ordinance of Yahweh, that those who practice such things are worthy of death. Do you think Paul is not recalling the law of Yahweh? Clearly he is. They not only do the same, but they, speaking of the things worthy of death, they not only do those things which are worthy of death, but they also give hearty approval to those who practice them. What are we seeing in this nation today? Absolutely the very same thing that they were seeing in Rome. And again, that empire fell.